Hello students, welcome to the English YouTuber. So today we're going to go through the entire story of A Triumph of Surgery from the Footprints Without Feet. So we're going to read the entire story and also mark the important points. The title of the story is A Triumph of Surgery. So triumph means victory. Okay. So there are these three main characters in the story. First is definitely the narrator, Mr. James Herriot. The second is Mrs. Pumphrey, who is the owner of the dog. And the third is the dog. His name is Tricky. Okay, so as we read the story, we will discuss the important questions. I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. He had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage with a leg at each corner. His eyes, bloodshot and rheumy, stared straight ahead, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. So here the question could be, why was the narrator really worried? So he was really worried when he saw the appearance of Tricky along with his owner, Mrs. Pumphrey. He had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage with a leg at each corner. His eyes was bloodshot and rheumy. Rheumy means watery. And he was staring straight ahead, and his tongue lolled from his jaw. Okay. So this is the appearance. You can talk about the body. He looked like a bloated sausage. Then his eyes and the tongue. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. He was so listless, Mr. Herriot. Listless means lack of energy. Or lack of enthusiasm. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up. Some malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. Okay. So what was Mrs. Pumphrey doing when she felt that the dog was listless or he had no energy? She thought that the dog was suffering from malnutrition, and therefore, apart from the meals that she was giving him, the dog, she also gave him extra malt and cod liver oil between meals and also Horlicks, a bowl of Horlicks at night. And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak that I had to relent. Relent means allow after you have refused. He does love cream cakes and chocolates, so I can't bear to refuse him. I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was his greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night, and I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? Well, he has little walks with me, as you can see, but Hodgkin, the gardener, has been down with lumbago. So lumbago is a pain in the lower back. So there has been no ring crowing lately. So she likes to pamper the dog with cream cakes and chocolates, and the problem of the dog was that it was greedy as well and it never refused food. So Mrs. Pumphrey also kept pampering him with a lot of food, and the dog was also greedy and ate everything. I tried to sound severe. So the veterinarian, who is Mr. James Herriot. Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right now and give him more exercise, he's going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. So what advice does the veterinarian give Mrs. Pumphrey? He asked him to give him more exercise and also harden her heart and keep him on a very strict diet. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Wrung her hands means like pressing and squeezing. Sometimes we do not remove water, so she just pressed her hands, her fingers. Oh, I will, Mr. Herriot. I am sure you are right. But it is so difficult, so very difficult. She set off, head down along the road as if determined to put the new regimen into practice immediately. Okay. So what did Mr. Pumphrey say was so difficult, so very difficult? Putting the dog on a very strict diet and also giving him more exercise. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. That means he expected a call from Mrs. Pumphrey in a few days. The expected call came within a few days. Okay, so here are the tweed coat, a dog having a whole wardrobe of himself of such expensive material, a raincoat for the wet day. All this shows that Mrs. Pumphrey was rich. The expected call came within a few days. Okay, now let's see, why did she call? Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. So distraught means very worried or upset. So why was Mrs. Pumphrey distraught? Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. So first he refused his favorite dishes, had bouts of vomiting. He spent all of his time lying on a rug, panting. Didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight. You know how much is a fortnight? Fortnight is 14 days. That is 2 weeks. And to be kept under observation. So, the doctor already predicted that the dog would be in such a critical condition, and therefore he had already anticipated the problem and he decided that he would hospitalize the dog for a fortnight. So why did Mr. Pumphrey call? Because the dog refused his favorite meal. He had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time lying down, refused to walk or refused to do anything at all. The poor lady almost swooned. Swooned means faint from extreme emotion. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. So pine and die means be sad and upset and thin and weak. Usually a person becomes like this when a near or dear one dies or passes away. So she expected that the dog would become like that without her presence. But it took a firm line. Tricky was very ill and this was the only way to save him. So what was the only way to save the dog? According to the doctor, to take him and hospitalize him for a fortnight. In fact, I thought it best to take him without any delay. Okay, so much is clear. Let's move forward. Followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailing. So she is wailing and crying loudly because they are taking her favorite dog away from her. I marched out of the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. The entire staff was roused and maids rushed in and out bringing his day bed, his night bed, his favorite cushions, his toys, his rubber rings, his breakfast bowl, his lunch bowl, his supper bowl. Realizing that my car would never hold all the stuff, I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of the little coats through the window, and I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive, and everybody was in tears. So this paragraph also shows that the lady was really rich because she had an entire staff of maids, and they had a day bed and a separate night bed for the dog, his favorite cushions in the bed. He had toys, rubber rings, and different bowl for different meals of the day, and also little various coats. Out of the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the side by my side. I patted the head and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Poor old lad, I said. You haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. Okay. So what cure did the doctor do to make sure that the dog would recover? Let's see. At the surgery, the household dogs surged around me. Surged is increased. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes and when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing around him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. So when Tricky did lay motionless on the carpet, the other dogs came and sniffed him and they decided that he was an uninteresting object and left him all alone. They ignored him. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. So the doctor made sure that there was no special treatment that was given to this dog just because he was used to extreme luxury. For 2 days, I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. So what did the doctor do? What was the cure? For 2 days, he gave him only water and no food. And at the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surrounding. And on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. So whimper is the small cry that the dogs do. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound. So this is the breed of dog, greyhound, and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden and Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. So still he was fat and could not easily walk. That is why he rolled slightly. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There was the usual headlong rush followed by the sound of high-speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the other, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of the meal. That is why they ate really fast, because if they were slow in eating, then the other dogs would come and eat their meal. So this was the treatment that Tricky was given. He was given no special treatment. He was given a box to lay down. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowl, licking casually inside one or two of them. So slowly here he is showing interest for food. So just like how Mrs. Pumphrey would overfeed him, the doctor did not do that. And he waited until the dog, Tricky, showed some interest in food. So he went and licked the bowls of the other dogs. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. So now he is showing interest in food. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medical treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrummages. So, scrummages means friendly fight. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, trampled on, and squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang and an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for a share at mealtime and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time of his life, so he had a wonderful time here because he had never had these experiences before, as he was pampered in a very luxurious life. So, if they ask him what medical treatment or what was the treatment given to him, he was not offered food for 3 days but only given water. No medical intervention was made, no medical treatment, but he ran a lot with the other dogs, joining in their friendly scrummages. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, trampled on, and squashed. So he ran the entire day. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew. And he felt like a tiger when he fought for his meals and he was hunting rats in his old hen house at night. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletin. So she was extremely loving towards the dog. But they say, right, sometimes too much of anything is bad. That is what happens in the story. I dodged the question about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger. So convalescing is recovering an illness. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring around fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time. So 1 dozen is 12, so 24 eggs at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibility of the situation began to dawn on the household. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. So when Mrs. Pumphrey came to know that Tricky was recovering from the illness, she started sending 2 dozen eggs and then later wine for Tricky's blood. And therefore, the doctor started having eggs for breakfast and also glasses of wine, several during the meal and 2 glasses of wine before. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled and reverently drunk. There were days of deep content. Content is satisfaction. Starting well with the extra eggs in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously around the fire with the brandy. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest. So this could be the question. Why was there a temptation to keep Tricky as a permanent guest? Because Mrs. Pumphrey sent eggs, wine and brandy. But I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight, I felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. That is, could be a limousine car. The chauffeur, that is the driver, opened the door and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey, almost lost in the interior. So her owning a limousine car and also having a chauffeur shows that she was rich. I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey, almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Herriot, do tell me the truth. Is he really better? Yes, he is fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling around and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail wagging, was the little golden figure of Tricky. So this was his improvement scene. Before he could not even move about when he had come here. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a little hard-muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. So here, lithe means flexible. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The shopper was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my hands in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. So what was the reaction of the dog when he saw Mrs. Pumphrey? He took off from the narrator's arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "oh" and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. So he was really excited to see his mistress. During the excitement, I helped the shopper to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats and bowls, none of which had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window, tears shone in her eyes, her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Herriot," she cried, "how can I even thank you? This is the triumph of surgery." So this is the story of how sometimes if you become overindulgent or over pampered or if there is overfeeding, then it could lead to negative consequences. I hope you enjoyed listening to this story. Please subscribe so that you don't miss any important videos that I upload. Study well, God bless you, and I'll be praying for you. Thank you.